Hello, and welcome everyone to our presentation titled Bees, Trees and Pollinators. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Leanne Gugan, and I am Willoughby Council's Environmental Education Officer. This presentation is one of our talks to support Council's Canopy of Life Tree Week, a week where we have celebrated the trees in our urban area and showcasing the immense benefits trees provide us in making our world habitable and beautiful. And so when looking at the benefits of trees, you might think of the aesthetics of beautifying our landscape, the carbon dioxide it absorbs, the oxygen it produces, the shade it gives, or perhaps maybe even the stability its roots provide to soil structure. But what about the food and protection trees provide many different species? Many people don't realise that our tall native trees are abuzz with life in the canopy foliage above. Because it is so high up, we don't usually get to see the stunning flowers when they are in bloom and all the creatures this attracts during the day and night. Next slide. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Leanne.
Lucky for us, we do have Emily with us, an expert on this topic. She has a PhD on native bees from the University of Sydney. She's a science communicator on urban ecology and pollinators, and someone who you might have even met at one of our educational workshops in the past. She sings and performs to kids at festivals. Welcome, Emily. I know you have a jam-packed presentation with a lot of great info to share, and therefore I just wanted to let everyone in the audience know that I don't know if we'll be able to get to questions at the end, but feel free to put your question into the Q&A. And if we do get time, then we will try at the end, but just wanted to manage expectations. Okay, thanks, and over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Leanne. It's very exciting to be here with you all to be sharing about our beautiful pollinators in our beautiful big tall trees. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Willoughby Council is on Gamma country and sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging and the incredible Indigenous wisdom that is held in this land. There are incredible relationships between people and country, between pollinators and trees that have happened since time immemorial. And that knowledge, that Indigenous wisdom and science is ongoing. I am very excited to talk about our pollinators in our big tall trees in Willoughby. They are exceptional as our pollinator highways. These canopies are what interconnect our pollinators who are buzzing around in these big tall trees, and they also represent an incredible abundance of food. I'm sure that in summertime, when you go for a little walk through the street trees, we've had a moment to hear that buzzing up in the canopy. That is literally the life that is buzzing with an abundance of bees that are in our big, tall, especially eucalypts in the summer season. Our big, tall trees are also vital to ecosystem structure and function. What I mean by that is that they are the big giants. They're holding everyone together. Those other layers in the ecosystem really do rely on those big, tall trees to bring it all together. They are food, they are shelter, and they are so much more too. In this talk, we're going to be focusing on those pollinators in the trees. And there are some other recorded talks that focus a little bit more on identifying the trees as well. So definitely have a listen. There's so much in this web series. Now, before we continue, I wanted to touch on pollination in its basic form. So essentially, we have some trees with their reproductive parts, which are the flowers. And because flowers or trees cannot walk or fly, sometimes they need a little help to bring the pollen from A to B. So this is where our bees or animal pollinators come in. And they are attracted to the nectar and the pollen that those flowers are providing. In this case, a bee might be looking for nectar, but because they are so furry, they're so fluffy, they get all this pollen stuck to their body. And when they go to the next flower, hopefully of the same species, they're going to deposit that pollen onto the next flower. That will then grow down the pollen tube. It'll fertilize the ovule or the reproductive part of the flower. That will grow into a seed. Maybe that's inside a fruit. And then there might be another animal that comes along who eats that fruit and deposits that seed somewhere else so that tree can then grow again. Trees and our pollinating insects and animals have evolved together like this for a very, very, very long time. And it's why we have such beautiful biodiversity. So let's meet some of these pollinators. I've got a few photos of some Willoughby locals. We've got a lovely sugar glider here, a rainbow lorikeet, and a grey-headed bat. They're our bigger pollinators, but we also have our smaller friends, the insects, of which I am so passionate. Over here from left to right, top to bottom, maybe you want to have a little think and try and guess for yourselves who these are. In the top left, I have our European honeybee. Then we have a hoverfly. Now, hoverflies are a kind of fly. You might notice that they only have 2 wings. They still have those yellow and black stripes, but their eyes are on the front of their head, not the side, and they have very short antennae. These are very important pollinators in winter, especially. Then we have our beetles, represented here by a lady beetle, but beetles have a huge biodiversity and are very important pollinators of a lot of our tree species. Down below on the left, you've got a butterfly. There are also moths who are really important pollinators of our flowering trees. And then in the middle there, I've got a wasp who might be a little harder to love, but I assure you wasps are incredibly important pollinators in the ecosystem, and they're also important predators. So they've got 2 really important functions, and we really need them for healthy, balanced predator-prey relationships in nature. And then down there, I've got a little blue-banded bee who's a native solitary bee, and I'm going to talk more about that bee in a minute. So you can see we've got these mammals, these birds, and these insects, and now we're going to have a little look and dive deeper into who we find in which trees around Willoughby. So before I continue, there's a big difference between the European honeybees and our native bees. Often when we think of bees, we might think of hives, colonies, queens, honey. But these are only one species of bee, and they're an introduced species, whereas we actually have over 2,000 species of native bees in Australia alone, 200 in the Greater Sydney area. And most of these bees are solitary. 90% of these bees are solitary. So what I mean by that is our solitary bees don't have queens, they don't have workers, but rather they're like little hobbit bees. They like to live alone, they like their space. They might dig a nest in a cavity in a tree or wood or in the ground. They will lay their egg, they will go out and collect pollen and nectar from our flowering trees, make a little bliss ball, pop that next to the egg, and then continue until they seal off their hive. So I'm going to introduce a couple of those native bees now, and then we're going to look into which trees they pollinate. So the first bee I want to introduce is the blue-banded bee. This is my personal favorite. You can see their blue and black bands on their abdomen. There are 3 species in the Willoughby Greater Sydney area, one of which is the Amygilla cingulata. These bees have big green eyes and they live in the ground. And they actually hold the world record for buzz pollination, which is that they can shake their head 350 times per second to shake pollen out of a flower, which is pretty amazing. Another bee I want to introduce is the leafcutter bee, or Megachilo sericorda. And you can see from these photos, she actually chomps semicircles in leaves, and she uses those chopped leaves to make little cozy sleeping bags inside her nest. In that photo there is a piece of split bamboo. You can see the nest that she's built. Another bee, this is not a solitary bee, but a semi-social bee, are the Exonura or reed bees. Now, these bees have a shovel-shaped abdomen, which they use to dig into reeds or pithy stems like lantana. And when I say semi-social, I mean they have this beautiful kind of community childcare program, you might think of it as, where they can share the nest. All right, I think it's time to jump into some trees. So, can you identify this tree? Maybe take a moment to look at the flowers, the bark, and the gum nuts and see if you can take a guess at which tree this is before I reveal it. The clues are in the pictures. Okay, I'm gonna reveal the answer now. This is an Angophora costata or a Sydney red gum. It's got a few names. This is one of my personal favourite trees when I go for bushwalks out in Willoughby. They've got this beautiful way of curling in amongst each other with the branches. They've got these dimples in the wood. They look very orangey red, especially in summertime. And they've got very, very attractive flowers to many pollinators. They're what we call a generalist pollinating flower. They can grow up to about 25 meters. And these particular flowers are quite shallow and full of nectar with multiple stamens. The stamens are the parts with the pollen on them. So, a classic pollinator of this tree is our grey-headed flying fox, which we're lucky enough to have here. And its cute furry face here in this photo is trying to lick the nectar out of the flower, and in the process, its face is going to get covered in pollen because it's so furry and fuzzy. And so when it goes to the next flower of an Angophora, it will deposit that pollen. It's also very popular amongst a range of birds and insects, like those native bees I introduced, because it is a generalist species. This is a beautiful, beautiful tree. Now, before I continue to introduce some different kinds of trees, especially eucalyptus, I invite you to think about what these flowers have in common when we look at them in more detail. We might notice that these particular flowers are all white or creamy colored. They have multiple stamens. There's a nectar in the middle of them. And it is these different features of flowers that attract a diversity of pollinators. So when we look up in the canopy and we're looking for who might pollinate which tree, we might notice four different features that are going to attract different pollinators. So these four features are the flower's color, the shape, the density, and the seasonality. And I'm going to go through these one by one. So when it comes to flower color, when we look up to the canopy, we might see white, creamy colored flowers, but these bees are actually seeing this in UV light. So if you look in the picture here, what might look yellow to us, to a bee, might look in this like reddy colored in the UV spectrum. And you can see that the color concentration is actually closer to where the nectar and the pollen is. Those flowers have evolved with pollinators to show them where the concentration of nectar and pollen is, giving them big arrows to come here and collect the pollen and give it to the next flower. Now, whereas bees are usually more attracted to what looks like purple or yellow to us, with many exceptions, birds are usually more attracted to what looks like red to us. You might notice in the Australian landscape, when we see red flowers, they're often attracting birds. Now, there are many, many, many exceptions to this rule, but just generally speaking. Bats, however, are more attracted to scent and the location of the flower rather than the color. And that also makes a lot of sense because they're pollinating at night. So, flower shape is another really important feature. Larger animals can access larger flowers. That makes sense. But also, the particular shape of the flower is really important too. So, a lot of eucalyptus trees have a shallow disc with multiple stamens, whereas, say, a coria might has a longer tube where bees and pollinators with longer tongues can access. When in the native bee world, uh, we have long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. So blue-banded bees, for example, can dive deep into a coria, which is a tube, whereas a little Lassia glossum, another little ground nesting bee, might only be able to get into a very shallow flower like a Wallenberger. Another important feature of flowers is the density in which they grow. So, when eucalypts, especially, are in bloom, they bloom in abundance. It is a buffet of the same kind of flower. And because some bees are social, i.e., they have queens and workers, they can recruit more of their own. And that's why we hear such a huge buzz up in the treetops because they're recruiting to this huge abundance and density of flowers. Bats tend to prefer flowers that are very dense together and also on the periphery of the canopy. So it's not just about the density, but also about the location of those flowers. So when we look up into the canopy and we look into the treetops, we can see these shapes, these colors, how dense those flowers are together, and kind of where they are in the landscape too. And that's going to really influence which pollinators will visit them. The final feature is seasonality. And what I mean by that is if we look at a calendar of when those flowers are blooming, different trees are going to bloom in different seasons. And a really important thing that we need to keep in mind is that those flowering times need to be overlapping and across the year in order to have a whole year worth of food for our pollinators. So we need not just big trees in our landscape, but we need a diversity of big trees with different flowering times. So that biodiversity that we have in Willoughby of these big canopy species is indispensable for our pollinators to feed throughout the year. All right, I think it's time to meet our next tree. Now, this one's a bit trickier, but I invite you to try and guess who this tree might be. This is the bark, the flowers, and the seeds, or the fruit, sorry. It's a little tricky, so I'm going to give you a clue for their common name. Still a little tricky, I might reveal it. It is a lemon-scented gum. That was your clue. It was meant to be lemon-scented. Or a Corymbia citriodora. This beautiful big tall tree can grow up to 50 meters tall, and it flowers from April to January. It's quite variable, and it's quite common in the Willoughby area. Now, there was a study on this particular tree that looked at the percentage of different pollinators that visit it. And they found that 73% of the pollinators were European honeybees, 11% were honey eaters, 11% were rainbow lorikeets, and 2% were flying foxes. So that's really interesting to look at. Of the pollinators that they looked at, that these are the percentages, it shows that in this particular season, the bulk were these honeybees, and they are a recruiting species. So when they find one flower that's delicious, they're gonna go for the whole tree. And then the next was these birds, and last was the flying foxes. But what's interesting about this is that whilst the bees were the most abundant, how far the pollen travels depends on the kind of pollinator. So a bee might go to multiple flowers on the same tree, quite close together. so pollinating within that same tree. But an animal like a bird or a bat can actually travel far longer distances. So they might be carrying the pollen from one tree of the same species to a whole nother tree of the same species, quite a few kilometers away. So that's quite interesting when thinking about that connectivity in the canopy that I was talking about, and how they can provide these highways for pollinators, because those animals are able to travel across not just within Willoughby, but to neighbouring suburbs as well, because they can fly quite far. So the trees that we have in our suburb are connected with other big trees in other places and are really invaluable for that beautiful species to continue everywhere. So these flowers are not just pretty, but the tree itself provides something else which is really important for a certain kind of pollinator, which is that it's a source of resin. So resin is like that tree sap that we might see. And we have a native bee, another favorite of mine, called a Tetragonella carbonaria, or stingless bee, which needs that resin to build their homes. In this picture, you can see the inside of a native stingless beehive. So that caramelly structure is made with propolis. And you can see that stingless bee is carrying some of that resin from that tree, from that lemon scented gum, and it's building its home with it. The yellow powdery bits inside of that structure on the top left hand corner, that is pollen that they've collected from a variety of sources. And the brown sticky stuff is, of course, honey. This is one of 11 species of native stingless bee of a social bee in Australia, and one of 2 in the Greater Sydney area. The other photo down the bottom of this slide is the entrance to a stingless beehive, and you can see that they've got tiny little dollops of resin on their legs, and they're currently building the inside of their home and protecting the outside of their home with that resin. So those big tall trees are not only food, they're not only habitat, but they're also providing that resin for our pollinators to build their homes. And these are another couple of photos of the inside of a stingless beehive. That's on the left is a cross section of that hive, and on the right is when you open it up, you can see that beautiful spiral structure inside, thanks to the resin which is turned into propolis from these beautiful big trees. So that's another photo of that lemon scented gum, of that Corymbia citriodora, and the propolis, the resin that it offers. Now, another bee that uses resin from trees is a firetail resin bee, or a Myrmecochile mystiasana. And you can see in these pictures that it's been collecting resin from a variety of sources to build its home. This one is a solitary bee, not a social species. So many pollinators are using different parts of these trees to build their homes as well. Now, those big, tall canopy species offer resin. They offer nectar and pollen, which we've already talked about. They offer habitats in the tree hollows and those big old trees that take a long time to build. And they can also offer seeds for our pollinators to eat and disperse as well. Which brings us to our next tree. So this is our next tree. I've got some photos here. We've got some flowers. We've got some leaves or needles. I'm sure you've seen this tree before. And its name is Alocasuarina littoralis, or commonly known as the black she oak. So you can see that bark there is very distinctive. Those needles also very distinctive. These trees grow up to about 15 meters. They're very common here. And they are usually dioecious, which means that they have separate female and male trees. And they have very odd modified flowers. What's interesting about these trees is that their seeds are very tasty to a very beautiful pollinating bird, our yellow-tailed black cockatoo. These are one of my favorite birds. And you can often hear them crunching on those seeds, getting a really good feed in amongst these big tall trees. Some other food trees for some other food for yellow-tailed black cockatoos are the seeds from casuarinas, the seeds of banksias, and even the insects in the bark of many tree species. This is a very special bird that really appreciates that we have these tall trees in our landscape. So our next tree is a little trickier. I've got the bark and the leaves and the flowers here. Maybe take a moment to see if you can guess who this tree is before I reveal it. Okay, I'm gonna give the answer now. It is a black wattle, or a Pelargoma serratifolia. The serratifolia refers to how the serrated leaf that we see. This black wattle can grow up to about 20 meters. They often grow in moist protected gullies, and so in those little microclimates that are a little bit rainforesty that we have amongst Willoughby, especially near water, this is where you might see these trees grow, and they flower from around October to December. We have a video here of one of those black cockatoos trying to get some insects out of the bark of this black wattle. So they're not just pollinated by these birds, but they also provide food in a different way as well. Now for another tree. All right, can we identify this tree? I'll give you a moment to think about it. This one's a little easier than the last two, I think. If you looked closely at the knobbly bark, if you think about the shape of the flower, if you look at those leaves, I'm sure you've met this tree before. I'll give you a moment to think about the name yourself, and I will reveal it now. It is a Banksia! Again, with that serrata, it's for that serrated leaf, sorry. It's often called an old man Banksia because it's a little gnarly, a little wobbly on the trunk. This isn't the tallest of our tall trees. It's not really a canopy species, but it's very, very, very important in that mid layer. And it attracts quite a few specialist pollinators, which is why I wanted to introduce it here. It is habitat for carpenter bees, I'll introduce in a moment. And it's also flowering December to June and attracts a myriad of pollinators, some specialists, as well as many birds. So a specialist pollinator that visits this flower is the Banksia bee, so called because it visits Banksias. And this Banksia bee, it's a kind of masked bee. And you can see the photo here where the females actually blow bubbles with the nectar and pollen of the flower. But the males have this curious behavior where they actually do their reproductive dance to attract a mate exclusively in Banksia trees. So another incredible thing that this tree represents is not just pollination or habitat or food, but it is a site of finding a mate, which is incredibly important for the reproduction of our native bees. So these Banksia trees are also really important habitat trees for our peacock carpenter bee or Xylocopa species. Carpenter bees are so called because they do, well, carpentry, and they like to build their homes in soft wood. So they often build their homes in the spikes of xanthorrhea or grass trees, as well as the soft wood of banksias. Here on the right, you can see what it looks like inside. I believe that's a xanthorrhea stem with the pupae of the carpenter bee. This is an incredibly beautiful bee. Look how shiny it is. Uh, and because these trees and these soft-wooded species are quite vulnerable to fire and bushfire, it means that these carpenter bees can lose their habitat quite easily. So protecting these trees is really, really important to reduce the vulnerability of carpenter bees and other species that rely on these particular trees in the long run. They do need fire to reproduce themselves for the banksia pods, but it's about that balance. And in any ecosystem, the relationship between the big tall trees protecting that area and the mid-story as well is going to be really important to things such like bushfire and other threats as well. All right, our next tree is represented by these photos. That is the bark. There are your gum nuts. We have some more flowers over here. Your big clue is in the leftmost picture. You might notice some scribbles. The tree that is here is a scribbly gum, or Eucalyptus haemastoma. So this tree can grow up to about 15 meters. And it's very, very long-lived. These trees are notorious for being hollow-bearing, and what I mean by that is they can create big hollows in the tree, especially when they're older, that lots of different animals are going to live in, like birds. And they flower from about July to November, and it's highly variable as well. Now, the scribbly gum has a really special relationship with this moth. So those squirrels that we see is the moth allowed to eat, and is what we see left behind relationship that we're seeing there.
Sorry,
Scribbly gums.
just 1 second,
Yes.
Emily. Just for maybe that, if you could go back that one slide,
Yeah.
you were, I couldn't hear you at that point. You just froze a little bit. So maybe you could go back and just explain again on that moth. That would be
Oh,
great. Not that one,
oh,
the one next one.
oh, yeah. So I was
Thank
just
you.
saying that the scribbles in the tree are where a moth has eaten as a larvae, and those scars are what is left after that moth has eaten through when they're a little larvae. So we're seeing another insect tree relationship in a different way as well. Sorry, I'm going to blow my nose. Oh, okay. The pollinators of our scribbly gum are incredibly diverse. Like many eucalyptus species, they are generalists. And so a myriad of pollinators are attracted to the flowers. They attract honey eaters, a whole variety of birds, gray-headed flying foxes, our honeybees and other native bees as well. So when they're in bloom, you can really see a whole different range of pollinators up in the treetops. And a lot of our eucalyptus trees are generalists and will attract many different animal species. All right, tree number 7. This one is a little trickier. I will be very impressed if anyone guesses this one. I don't know if you're guessing correctly or not, but have a little think looking at the bark. looking at the flowers. I'll give you a moment to have a think. Okay, the answer is, oh, I've actually got a clue for you for this one. This is your visual clue for the common name. The answer is the Sydney peppermint or Eucalyptus piperata. So that was my attempt at a clue with some black pepper and some mint. These are another beautiful generalist eucalypt that can grow for 20 meters tall. They're also very long-lived, hollow-bearing, and they are mostly in bloom in summertime. These trees attract a myriad of pollinators, and they are a generalist amongst nectar feeders. So the sugar glider that we met before, that rainbow lorikeet, and flying foxes. And they're not just good for pollen and for nectar, but they also provide homes for these species as well. All right, so our next tree is this one. If we check out the bark, especially, that's your big clue. The flowers in the middle there. Have a little think, have a little look. I assure you, you've seen these trees before. They're a very common street tree in Willoughby. And they also grow in our little remnant forests around as well. The answer is our Melaleuca quinquenervia, or a broad-leaved paperbark. This photo of these paperbarks growing as street trees. They're very common around Willoughby Council area. They grow from about 8 to 25 meters, depending on where they're growing. They'll be a little bit shorter, a bit taller, but they have this incredible habit of having multiple branches, and when they're older, they can be really thick at the trunk with many, many branches growing out of them. And they flower from September to March. They can be a bit variable as well. Some important pollinators of these paperbark trees are our rainbow lorikeets. I believe this is a little video, it's quite cute. So our rainbow lorikeets, I'm sure we've seen them up in the treetops before. And they're also a generalist, and they will attract many, many, many of those different native bees that I mentioned before as well. All right, we have one last tree to guess the pollinators that are up in the treetops for. And these are your clues. Here is the bark, here are the flowers. Have a little look, have a little think. This one's a little bit trickier, but perhaps if you've done your eucalyptus ID workshops in that Willoughby Council has been offering, you might be able to guess correctly. This is a bloodwood, or a Corymbia gomifera, a red bloodwood. These trees are about 25 to 30 meters tall when they're at their biggest, and they are a variable flowering season of December to June as well. Now, the grey-headed flying fox is a very common pollinator of these trees. You'll notice that the grey-headed flying fox are important pollinators for a lot of our tall trees. That makes a lot of sense because when these tall trees are in bloom, they have a hugely dense array of flowers. And it's easy for them to be seen from up high, and they can connect between different trees that the flying foxes are easily able to see and attracted to the incredibly rich amount of nectar in those fluorescences. So there is such diversity in the canopy. We can see a whole bunch of pollinators that I introduced. We've got those gliders, lorikeets and other birds, a grey-headed flying fox, who can travel much longer distance between the trees and the canopy. We've also got our insect pollinators. I've got a photo of a European honeybee there, but as we learned already, there's over 2,000 species of native bees. And that's not even mentioning the hoverflies, the beetles, the butterflies, and the wasps that are going to be up in these treetops. I introduced a lot of different eucalypts in the Willoughby area, and those being those generalist flowers that they are, attracting a lot of those a wide variety and groups of insects. And there are different ways of learning more about those insects and those trees over in Willoughby. This is our tree week in Willoughby, so not just this week, but all year round. I invite you to go for a walk in your area. There are these tree trails in Willoughby that you can find the maps online in local cafes, and some of these street trees have some information on the particular tree that you can see when you walk around. And I invite you, especially in spring, summertime, as it starts to warm up, to look for the pollinators and the life that these big trees represent as well. This is a beautiful paperbark tree on one of the many tree-lined streets of Willoughby. You can see that there are so many branches popping out, and you can just imagine the myriad of life that is blossoming in the flowers when it is pollinator season, when it's at its most abundant of flowers. So this time of year, you can appreciate the tree itself, and in summertime, later in the year, you might be able to see the life that it's holding as well. Another really awesome way to appreciate these trees and the life that they hold is by participating in several citizen science projects. So one that is running every year is called the Aussie Bird Count. That will be from the 20th to the 26th of October this year. And you can go for a walk around in your area and look for the birds that you're seeing in these treetops in October. That will be in spring, so a lot of the trees that I introduced will be blooming then. There is also the wild pollinator count in Australian Pollinator Week. So this also includes birds and bats, but it's definitely got an incredible focus on the insect pollinators that I introduced. So this is your chance to try and identify some of those 2,000 species of native bees up in the big tall canopy. This week of citizen science runs from the 8th to the 16th of November this year. And it's a really excellent way through the resources that are through this website to learn to identify these insects in more detail. And to appreciate that these big, tall, important canopy species are hosting a whole bunch of these insects and other pollinators as well. Uh, a really fun tool that you can use for citizen science is called iNaturalist. And this is not just for in those particular citizen science weeks, but any time of year, you can use this tool to take photos of the animals that you're seeing in these trees. You can also take photos of the trees and plants themselves, and sometimes they can help you identify who they are. As well as upload your data into big national databases, which help scientists to document the life that is in our streetscapes as well. Look out for any bioblitzes happening. It can be a really fun way to really connect with the trees and the life in those trees in your streets. Finally, one of my favorite identification tools for eucalypts is called this Euclid app. There is a web version, there's also an app version. The app version is paid, and it's a really great lucid key, which can help you identify some of the eucalypts. Eucalypts are notoriously difficult to tell apart, but when you're on your next bushwalk or street walk, it can be a really fun way to engage with who these trees are in more detail, because the more we learn about them, the more we can connect. So, finally, I wanted to emphasize the incredible life that these big canopy species host, not just in terms of pollinators by providing nectar and pollen flowering throughout the year, but they're also habitat for many, many species, especially birds, insects, mammals, because a lot of these big tall trees are long lived, and it's in that aging process that they create those hollows from those fallen branches and other factors. And so they represent so much in terms of food, in terms of shelter. Some of these species offer resin for those stingless bees to collect, or those resin bees to collect where they build their homes. And they also offer seeds for other animals to eat. They're incredibly important to structure our ecosystems, to connect our ecosystems and these pollinator pathways, and offer this canopy of life that this whole week is about, but that is valid throughout the year, because without these big trees, we wouldn't have these homes, we wouldn't have this abundance of flowers for our pollinators to connect with, and we wouldn't have these highways that are connecting our suburb here in Willoughby with other suburbs as well. So the value of these tall trees is really, really, really indispensable. We need to conserve these big tall trees, and we need to plant more and more and more and more and more so that they can be the big tall trees of the future too. I'm really excited, Leanne, because we actually do have a little bit of time for questions. Please throw me all your native bee questions and your pollinator questions up in the treetops if you have some.
Thank you, Emily. That was really insightful into the world of pollinators and their relationship with trees. That flew by. I was really keen to see, well, I want to go through actually all the 2,000 species, native bee species. They look so interesting and fascinating, some of the colors, but even when they're not what you think that they should look like either.